Yeah, I want to talk to you for just a few minutes about a reoccurring objection that I get to the fulfilled paradigm. When I point out that Daniel 7 is the only prophecy of the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds with the holy angels for the opening of the book's judgment, and that Jesus quoted verbatim from this prophecy, Daniel 7:13, in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and verse 30. Jesus quoted verbatim from Daniel 7:13. And then he said that all the tribes of the land will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. And then he said, this generation will not pass away until all these things be fulfilled. And so in order to evade the specificity of Jesus' time statement, rather than people allowing Scripture to interpret Scripture, they parrot this Johnny-come-lately man-made doctrine of the fig tree generation. Now, while it is true that during the Old Testament existence of Israel, her covenantal status was compared at times to a fig tree, such as in texts like Hosea 9, verse 10, Jeremiah 24, and Micah 7. But this idea that in the Olivet Discourse that Jesus is predicting the restoration of Israel's statehood, this is of modern origin, and literally less than 100 years ago. So that's how new, that's how recent this idea really is. And this idea was an invention to escape the force of Jesus' words in Matthew 24:34, when he specified that all of the things, not some, not most, not all but one, but all of these things would be fulfilled in this generation. Then, in order to escape the force of these simple but emphatic words, then man has invented this idea of the fig tree generation. And the irony of this doctrine is the fact that when people assert that this assumed fig tree generation began in May of 1948, when the nation of Israel gained statehood, this fig tree doctrine didn't originate until after 1948. Again, that's how new this doctrine is. Now, the Scofield Reference Bible set the stage for this Israel-centric futurism. And then post-1948 prophecy pundits needed a way to explain away the force of the phrase, this generation, in Matthew 24:34. And so then the fig tree parable of Matthew 24:32 was reinterpreted then as Israel's rebirth in 1948. And then this generation of verse 34, well, that must have been referring to the people alive in 1948. And so the major popularizers, if we can make a word, those who made popular, the major ones anyway, of this doctrine was Hal Lindsey and his late great Planet Earth, published in 1970, Chuck Smith, Tim LaHaye, and then later into a prophecy conference culture. And again, this is a rescue doctrine. It is not an exegetical conclusion. In Scofield's notes on the Olivet Discourse, actually we have to back up from that. In his notes on Matthew 21 verse 19, the withered fig tree, where Jesus cursed the fig tree, and it came the next day and it was withered. Well, he concludes that this was a parabolic miracle concerning Israel, which probably no one would dispute that. But then he explicitly cross-links that to the parable of the fig tree in Matthew 24, and then asserted that this is a prophecy that Israel will again bud. And so Scofield set the stage for this by reconstructing this parable from simple seasonal imagery into a prophecy of the reemergence of Israel. And then in his Olivet Discourse outline, Scofield treats Luke 21, 20 through 24 as AD 70 correctly, but then he contradicts himself by asserting that Matthew 24:15 and following, the parallel to Luke 21, 20 to 24, he treats that as a future crisis. Again, self-contradictory. And then he lists the sign of the fig tree inside that future end time sequence, the assumed end time sequence. And so the thing is, Jesus didn't say that this was a sign. He specifically called it a parable. If he had intended this to be a sign, then he would have said so, just like he did 2 verses earlier, when he specified there would be great signs from heaven. Luke 21:11. But you see, once Israel became a nation in May of 1948, then Scofield's interpretation, his interpretive link, then, well, now it has a real-world hook. And so budding then evolved into the claim of statehood. And Lindsay popularized the countdown idea. Well, the budding, well, that was 1948. And so then a generation, well, that equals 40 years. And so Lindsay later quoted his own 1970 wording from the late great Planet Earth, that the generation, it would be the generation that sees the signs, and that's what we always, in every objection, that's what it is. That's the generation that would see the signs. In other words, not this generation, like Jesus said, but that generation. And so this then is referring to the assumed rebirth of the state of Israel. And then the generation is something like 40 years, and that's what Lindsay said. Chief among them, the rebirth of the state of Israel, and a generation is something like 40 years. And so within 40 years or so, again quoting Lindsay, within 40 years or so of 1948, all these things could take place. But not trying to be Captain Obvious here, since we're all still here, then this doctrine obviously was proven to be false, as futurism always has been wrong, and it will continue to always be wrong without fail. And Lindsay did not initially set a specific calendar date, but he did do 2 decisive things. Number one is he defined the fig tree as the budding, 1948, and then he defined a generation as 40 years. And so that combination invited the arithmetic, whether Lindsay wanted that or not. And so by the late 1970s, prophecy teachers were openly saying that 1948 plus 40 years, well, that's 1988. Therefore, the second coming and or the rapture, well, that must occur before or at least by 1988. And then even Lindsay himself later tried to soften this, but alas, it was too late. The predictions were already unleashed. And probably the most famous crystallization of this was Edgar Whisenant, who published 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988, published, you guessed it, in 1988. And Whisenant explicitly argued that the fig tree equals Israel, and the fig tree budded in 1948. And so a generation, well, that's 40 years, which that's accurate. We get that from Hebrews chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. when Israel wandered in the wilderness, that generation, that was 40 years. So that defines a generation, a biblical generation, as 40 years. So then, therefore, Matthew 24:34 requires this generation to be fulfilled by 1988. And so his little booklet sold millions and millions of copies. And it was endorsed, or at least tolerated, by many prophecy circles. And it was handed out in churches, it was handed out in conferences, and this is where the doctrine became overtly date-driven, okay? But then again, guess what? 1988 failed. Again, we're still here, right? So it failed. And so the thing is, the doctrine didn't disappear. People didn't say, okay, well, that's proven to be a false doctrine. Let's study something else. No, it didn't disappear. It just mutated. And so Whisenant revised the dates from 1988 to 1989. Well, then that failed. Well, then it was 1993, and well, that failed. And so Lindsay and others then just redefined a generation as a lifetime. And so that's the same thing the Jehovah's Witnesses did in their prophecy predictions with their 1914 prediction. And that didn't happen. And then it was 1918, and that didn't happen. Well, then it was 1925, and that didn't happen. And then it was 1970 something. I forgot the year. But again, same thing. It failed because futurism is always wrong. But the doctrine just mutates. It just keeps changing because people are gullible, and because they don't study the Scripture, then it just keeps swallowing down hook, line, and sinker the same failed pattern over and over again. And so with the 1914 prediction, people now today, 2026, well, they have to be 112 years old to still be any of that generation, which again, that's a redefinition of generation. But if that was the way it was to be used, then is there anybody still alive today that's 112 years old? I mean, maybe there's one person somewhere. Who knows? But again, this is self-defeating over and over again. The same repetition over, and that's the textbook definition of insanity. Making the same mistake over and over again. And so I think most people have finally stopped giving out numbers, but they have kept the fig tree premise, that this was Israel. And again, this is the objection we always get. Well, he was talking about the fig tree generation. And so, that's, there's never any exegesis of the text. It's just a blank assertion, as if that's all that's required. Just because I told this guy that, well, it's the fig tree generation, then I'm the winner. I'm the winner of the discussion. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. Stating your opinion is not a valid argument. So when we look at the text, we see that in verse 27 of the Olivet Discourse, Jesus said, "For as the lightning," now he's been giving them signs. He's been telling them, you've got to watch for these because it's going to be quick. It's going to come quickly. And he said, "It's as the lightning comes out of the east and shines even to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." And the word coming there in the Greek is the singular noun parousia. All right. So there is this specific Greek phrase, so also will the parousia of the Son of Man be. And that exact phrase is repeated 2 more times. Well, you find it in verse 37, the days of Noah, and then again in verse 39. And so this creates the literary device known as inclusio. All All right, this is a bracketed discussion. And so everything in between the brackets of so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. Between these two bookends, everything in between is grammatically tied to those bookends. The point of fact being, the grammatical structure of the text does not allow verse 32 to be ripped out of this context. And you see, when Jesus said that let those that are those who are in Judea, they're to flee to the mountain when they see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. That's Daniel 12:11. When you see this, notice the urgency, folks. Those that are in Judea, flee to the mountains. Those that are on the housetop, don't even take time to come down to get your stuff out of the house. Flee immediately. Let him that's in the field, don't go back to the house to get your clothes. Flee immediately. You see, pray that your flight be not in the winter nor on the Sabbath day. Why? Because if it was in the winter, that would impede their flight. If it was on the Sabbath day, the gates of the city would be closed and it would impede their flight. All right? So he's giving them these warnings. And then he says, for as the lightning comes out of the east, shines into the west, this is how fast and unexpected this would be. And so this is the reason Jesus is giving them signs, not parables. He's giving them signs to watch for, to know when it is near. In fact, Mark and Luke record one question by the disciples that Matthew didn't mention. And that is, what shall be the sign, not a parable, what shall be the sign when all these things are about to be fulfilled? Again, that's Mark and Luke's record. And so Jesus gave them signs, not parables. He gave them signs to watch for at the outset of the discourse. And then when explaining the parousia of the Son of Man, verses 27 through 39, in the middle of this, he gives them this parable of all the trees, Luke's record, that when all the trees begin to bud, that is an indication that spring is near. Likewise, when they would see these signs, that's the budding, when you would see these signs that he just gave them, then they would know that all these things are about to be fulfilled, and they were to flee to the mountains of Pella. And so there's no such thing as a fig tree generation. Jesus is using the phrase, this generation, just like he used it right before he walked out of the temple to give this discourse, when he was speaking face to face with the scribes and the Pharisees. And he called them a generation of vipers. He laid the blood guilt of all the righteous martyrs right at their feet. And he said, all the righteous blood shed on the earth, all the way back to Abel, would come on them. The people he was looking right in the eyes. And then he said, assuredly I say unto you, the people he was looking right in the eyes, assuredly I say unto you, all these things will come upon this generation. And this phrase here in Matthew 23 is grammatically identical to the phrase this generation of Matthew 24:34. And so to reiterate, there is no such thing as a fig tree generation, folks. This is just something that was made up after 1948. All right? We got to start using our head for something besides a hat rack and an echo chamber. All right? You've got to learn how to study Scripture and to allow Scripture to interpret Scripture. All right? Thank you so much for your time.